My name is Zahra Sinclair. I'm in my mid 30s, and for over a decade, I've worked in corporate consulting, client facing, high pressure, the kind of environment where tone matters as much as content. I live in a world of polished slides, carefully timed pauses, and conference calls where everyone pretends to be neutral while silently ranking each other. People usually underestimate me before I finish my first sentence, sometimes before I even start speaking. It's the accent first, then the assumptions that quietly follow it. I wasn't born into this industry. I learned it, I studied it, I adapted to it. But no matter how fluent I became in its language, there was always a subtle reminder that I was still considered slightly outside, not unqualified, just not quite what people imagined when they pictured authority, or leadership, or ease. I've always been described as reliable, not brilliant, not commanding, reliable. I'm the one who delivers, the one who catches errors before clients see them, the one who stays calm when conversations turn tense. I don't interrupt, I don't dominate, I don't perform confidence. I practice competence, and in many workplaces, that makes you useful without making you visible. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, cinematic way. There are no shouting matches, no public takedowns, no moment where everyone suddenly claps. It's about something quieter. It's about what happens when professionalism is mistaken for tolerance, when silence is interpreted as permission, and when respect is slowly replaced with familiarity that crosses a line. The moment this story centers around is simple. During a client call, my boss mocked my accent, not aggressively, not angrily, casually, as if it were harmless, as if I would laugh along. I didn't. What followed wasn't immediate. There was no confrontation that day. No raised voice, just a shift, internal at first, a recalibration, a recognition that professionalism ends where respect does. This is a story about restraint, about patience, about how power doesn't always announce itself when it arrives. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it documents, sometimes it moves so quietly that the people who underestimated you don't realize what's changed until the ground beneath them is already different. I'm telling the story honestly, not to dramatize it, not to exaggerate it, but because many people have lived some version of this moment, and we're taught to swallow it. So before I go further, let me ask you something gently and sincerely. Have you ever stayed quiet in a moment that deserved respect, just to keep the peace, only to realize later what that silence cost you? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed me from meeting to meeting, from performance review to performance review. Dependable. It sounded like praise, and for a long time I accepted it as such. Dependable meant I showed up. It meant my work didn't need babysitting. It meant deadlines were met, clients were calm, and problems quietly disappeared before they escalated. But dependable also meant predictable, and predictable people rarely get watched closely. In our firm, visibility came from volume, from confidence performed at high decibels, from the ability to speak quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. Even when the substance was thin, I didn't play that game. I spoke when I had something precise to say. I waited. I listened. I chose words carefully, partly out of habit, partly because I'd learned that when you speak with an accent, every sentence is judged twice, once for meaning and once for delivery. So I learned to make my meaning undeniable. I was often the only woman in the room, sometimes the only one who looked like me. On video calls, I noticed how eyes moved when I spoke, briefly attentive, then drifting. Not dismissive, just elsewhere, as if my voice blended into the background noise of professionalism. My boss, Mark, liked to introduce me as our detail person, not our strategist, not our client lead, the detail person. It was meant kindly. I think that matters. He trusted me. He relied on me. When something sensitive needed handling, it landed on my desk. When a client was difficult, I was looped in quietly to smooth things over. I became the bridge, the buffer, the person who absorbed friction so others could appear effortless. In meetings, I often sat slightly back from the table. Not physically, just conversationally. I would prepare thoroughly, anticipate objections, and map out contingencies. Then I'd watch as louder voices took up space, sometimes repeating ideas I'd already shared in earlier memos. When that happened, I didn't interrupt, I didn't correct, I took notes, I adjusted timelines, I made it work. No one ever accused me of lacking confidence. They just never tested whether I had it. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being good at your job without demanding recognition for it. It's comfortable for everyone else. You don't disrupt hierarchies. You don't challenge egos. You don't force recalibration. I told myself this was strategic, that patience was maturity, that long-term respect was built quietly, and to some extent that was true. But there was another layer I didn't acknowledge at the time, a subtle expectation that I would absorb things others wouldn't, that I would let small comments slide, that I would translate awkward moments into grace, that my silence was not neutrality, but accommodation. I noticed how jokes were framed around me, never directly at me, how comments would pause just long enough to see if I'd react, how my lack of reaction was taken as agreement. Still, I didn't feel wronged, not yet. I believed in the system, in professionalism, in the idea that if you consistently delivered value, respect would follow. I believed restraint was strength. That being underestimated gave you room to move, and it did, just not in the way I expected. At that stage of my life, I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I was focused. I cared deeply about doing good work, about being fair, about not becoming defensive in environments that rewarded composure. I thought I knew who I was to them. I didn't yet understand what that role allowed and what it quietly invited. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the truth I'm least proud of, not because it hurt, but because of how easily it could have been dismissed. And in fact, it was, by everyone else, including me at first. We were on a routine client call, a mid-sized account, international team, cameras on, as usual. I had been asked to walk the client through a revised timeline. Nothing controversial, just a clarification after a scope adjustment. I had prepared carefully, anticipating questions, rehearsing the phrasing so it would be clear and efficient. I spoke calmly, slowly, precisely. When I finished, there was a brief pause, not an uncomfortable one, just the kind of silence that comes when people are processing information. Then Mark leaned back in his chair, smiled into the camera, and said lightly, "Well, there you have it, translation included." A few people laughed, softly, automatically. I felt it register before. I felt it hurt. Like a paper cut. You don't bleed immediately, but you know something has broken the surface. I looked at my screen. The client smiled politely, uncertain whether this was a joke meant for them or something internal they weren't supposed to notice. I waited, just a second, long enough for anyone, to redirect the conversation. No one did. Mark continued, still smiling. "You know how it is," he added, waving his hand casually. "Zahra keeps us all on our toes." The call moved on. I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet know what I was reacting to. It was framed as humor, light, inclusive even. And humor, especially in corporate spaces, carries protection. If you challenge it, you become the problem, too sensitive, too serious, not a team player. So I stayed still. On the outside, I nodded. On the inside, I made a note. What stayed with me wasn't the comment itself. It was the way the room accepted it, the ease with which it passed, the absence of correction. No one checked in afterward. No one said, "Hey, that was odd," or "Are you okay?" Because there was nothing to be okay about. Officially, after the call, Mark messaged me privately. "Great job on the timeline," he wrote. A thumbs up emoji followed. I stared at the message longer than necessary. There was no malice in it. That's what made it harder to name. If he had been openly cruel, I would have recognized it immediately. But this was different. This was familiarity slipping into something else, a casualness that assumed my consent. I told myself it wasn't worth dwelling on, that I'd been in tougher rooms, that intent mattered, that context mattered. And yet, later that evening, replaying the call in my mind, I noticed something else. Not just what was said, but when it was said. Right after I had spoken, right after I had done my job well, as if to reframe the moment, to soften my authority before it settled. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me alert. From that day on, I started paying closer attention. Not in a paranoid way, in a professional one. I listened more carefully to the tone, to timing, to patterns. I noticed who the jokes traveled through and who they landed on. That comment was never mentioned again. It didn't need to be. It had done its work quietly. I didn't confront Mark. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't even mention it to colleagues. But I remembered it. And once you remember the first small cut, you start noticing how often the blade comes out. After the first time, it became easier for it to happen again. Not because the comments grew sharper, they didn't. They stayed light, almost affectionate. That was the danger of them. They arrived wrapped in humor, in familiarity, in the unspoken rule that if something is said with a smile, it shouldn't be taken seriously. Mark began doing it in small ways, mimicking cadence, not words, paraphrasing my points in a slightly exaggerated rhythm before passing them on to the group, occasionally introducing me on calls with a half-joking, "Bear with us, accents aside, she's the brains here." Each time, there was a pause, a glance around the virtual room, a brief opening where the moment could be redirected. Each time it wasn't. I noticed how quickly people adapted, how laughter became reflexive, how silence filled in where discomfort might have lived. No one was cruel. That's important to say. No one leaned forward to humiliate me. They leaned back and let it slide. And in doing so, they helped normalize it. I told myself this was the cost of not being defensive, that calling attention to it would only give it more power, that I was choosing professionalism over pettiness. I reminded myself that Mark didn't mean harm, that he trusted me, relied on me, praised my work when it counted. So I adjusted. I softened my presence, smiled a little more when jokes were made, let comments pass without reaction. I made myself easier to work with, as if ease itself could undo imbalance. I convinced myself that this was maturity, that I was playing the long game. But normalization is subtle. It doesn't announce itself as surrender. It feels like pragmatism. The comments became part of the environment. Like background noise, you stopped noticing because acknowledging it would be exhausting. I stopped anticipating respect in those moments and started anticipating management of reactions, of impressions, of outcomes. I noticed how my silence was interpreted, not as dignity, but as agreement. The absence of objection became permission. The jokes didn't escalate in volume, but they settled in frequency, comfortable, unchallenged. And something else shifted too. Clients began directing questions to Mark even when I had just explained the issue. Colleagues began summarizing my points after I spoke, as if to validate them. Not maliciously, habitually. The framing changed. I was no longer the authority, I was the source material. I told myself I could live with that my work mattered more than my voice, that outcomes mattered more than perception. What I didn't admit, at least not yet, was that I was slowly shrinking to fit a role that had been assigned without my consent. There's a strange loneliness in being respected privately and diminished publicly, in knowing your value while watching it be subtly redirected through others. I still received praise, still got strong reviews, still advanced. But the space I occupied became narrower. I started choosing words that would be harder to mimic, shorter sentences, less rhythm, less personality. I edited myself not for clarity, but for safety, so there would be nothing to imitate, nothing to joke about. That was the moment I should have paused, not because I was being hurt, but because I was being shaped. I rationalized it all. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was a small thing, that many people dealt with worse, that I was lucky to be where I was. And I was. But luck doesn't excuse erosion. By the time I realized how normal the disrespect had become, it no longer felt like something external. It felt embedded, accepted, almost expected. I hadn't spoken up not because I lacked courage, but because I believed silence was neutral. I didn't yet understand that silence, repeated often enough, becomes a signal. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to understand that the role I was playing was never something I chose. It was something that slowly settled around me, shaped by expectation and reinforced by my own compliance. Not obedience, compliance, the quiet kind, the kind that feels reasonable in the moment. I was the one who fixed things. When a client misunderstood a proposal, I clarified. When internal teams disagreed, I translated. When deadlines slipped, I adjusted timelines and absorbed the pressure. I became known as someone who could be trusted to handle it, whatever it was. And because I handled things well, I was given more to handle. But handling doesn't come with visibility. It comes with reliance. People lean on you without looking at you too closely. They assume you'll be there, steady and uncomplaining, because you always have been. In meetings, decisions were made around me, not with me. I was looped in after strategies were outlined, asked to refine, implement, and execute. I was praised for being thorough, for being flexible, for being calm under pressure, never for being decisive, never for being a leader. I began to notice how others spoke about me when I wasn't present. not negatively, carefully, as if I were a tool rather than a variable. Zahra will take care of it. Zahra's great with details. Zahra doesn't mind. That last one stayed with me. I hadn't said I didn't mind. I had simply not objected. There's a difference between being low ego and being low impact. I told myself I was choosing the former, but the organization had quietly assigned me the latter. Mark relied on me more than anyone else on the team. That was the irony. He trusted my judgment, my discretion, and my ability to manage complexity. He just didn't seem to recognize me as someone whose authority needed protecting. I was safe, predictable, useful, invisible. And invisibility has its own expectations. Invisible people are expected to adapt, to absorb discomfort, to smooth over moments that might otherwise require accountability. They are assumed to be resilient by default. I saw it clearly during one internal review meeting. A junior colleague presented a framework I had built months earlier. My name wasn't mentioned. No credit was given. Not out of malice, out of habit. The work had detached from me. I watched it happen without reacting. I told myself that ownership wasn't the point, that outcomes mattered. But something in me shifted. Not angrily, not loudly, just precisely. I realized then that the role I was in was not temporary. It was stable, reinforced, comfortable for everyone else. And as long as I stayed in it, nothing would change. This wasn't about accents anymore, or jokes, or even respect in the abstract. It was about position, about how quietly accepting small dismissals had trained others on how to treat me. I had become the person who made things easier. And ease, when it's one-sided, is a kind of erasure. That realization didn't come with resolve or rebellion. It came with clarity, the calm kind, the kind that doesn't demand immediate action, but does demand honesty. I finally admitted something to myself that I had avoided for years. I wasn't being underestimated by accident. I was being placed. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no sharp exchange, no moment anyone else would remember. That's how I know it mattered. It was another client call, different account, different region. I wasn't the lead on paper, but everyone knew I had built the strategy behind it. I had spent weeks analyzing risk, mapping contingencies, and preparing a narrative that would keep the client confident without revealing internal uncertainty. Halfway through the call, a client asked a technical question. It wasn't directed at me, but it should have been. The answer sat with me, fully formed, clear. Before I could speak, Mark jumped in. He hesitated, just slightly. His explanation wandered. He circled the idea without landing it. I watched the client's expression shift, subtle confusion, polite patience. I waited. Mark finished, and there was a pause, the kind that asks for clarification without saying so. Mark glanced at me. "Zahra," he said lightly, "you want to translate that?" Translate. There it was again, not sharp, not cruel, casual, familiar, accepted. In that moment, something inside me went still. I answered the question, calmly, cleanly. I clarified the risk model, reframed the timeline, and gave the client exactly what they needed. The confusion disappeared. The call moved on. No one commented on it. No one acknowledged the contrast. But I felt it. For the first time, I noticed how often I had been placed in the position of repair rather than authority. How often my role began where someone else's clarity ended. How frequently I was invited to translate rather than lead. And suddenly, the pattern was undeniable. After the call, I didn't feel angry. I felt finished. Not with the job, not with the people, with the illusion that this would correct itself if I stayed patient. I went back to my desk and opened a document. Not to vent, not to complain. I wrote one sentence. Professionalism ends where respect does. I didn't share it, I didn't say it out loud, but I let it sit there, visible, while I worked. That sentence didn't make me confront anyone. It didn't push me toward action immediately. It did something quieter. It reorganized my priorities. I realized I had been operating under an unspoken rule, that maintaining harmony was more important than maintaining boundaries. That being easy to work with was the same as being respected. It isn't. That day, I stopped absorbing things automatically. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't make a point. I just noticed that when I was being positioned as support instead of source. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. I began to understand that silence isn't neutral when it's predictable. That my calm had become a resource others used to avoid discomfort. That my professionalism was being counted on to carry moments that should have been shared. The shift wasn't emotional, it was strategic. I didn't decide to fight, I decided to stop compensating. That's a subtle difference, but it changes everything. From that day forward, I paid attention not just to what was said, but to what was expected of me afterward. Who was allowed to misspeak? Who was allowed to recover? Who was allowed to be human? And who was expected to be seamless? I didn't change how I spoke, I changed how I listened. And in that listening, something solid began to form. Not anger, not resentment, resolve. After that day, I didn't suddenly find my voice. I refined my silence. Before, my quiet had been automatic, a default setting shaped by habit, culture, and a belief that restraint was always virtuous. Now it has become deliberate, chosen, calibrated. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine. When someone misspoke in a meeting, I didn't rush to clarify unless I was explicitly asked. When timelines slipped because of vague leadership, I documented the ambiguity instead of smoothing it over. When jokes landed where they shouldn't, I let the silence sit just a second longer than comfortable. Not long enough to be confrontational, just long enough to be noticed. The reaction was subtle, but telling. At first, nothing changed. People are slow to recalibrate when convenience has been working in their favor. My colleagues still assumed I would step in, still spoke loosely, trusting that I'd translate complexity into clarity after the fact. And when I didn't, they filled the space themselves, awkwardly. I noticed how often my absence of intervention exposed gaps that had previously been hidden by my presence. Meetings ran longer. Clients asked follow-up questions. Explanations had to be repeated. No one connected it to me. That was the point. Mark, in particular, seemed to misread the shift. He didn't see it as intentional. He saw it as withdrawal. He asked if I was overloaded, if I needed support, if everything was okay. I told him the truth, carefully. I'm prioritizing clarity and accountability, I said. Where responsibilities are defined, outcomes tend to improve. He nodded, approved, moved on. That was another lesson. When you speak in systems language, personal discomfort disappears into abstraction. People hear what they're trained to hear. So I stayed within the frame. I continued doing excellent work. I just stopped compensating for others' imprecision. I responded to what was asked, not what was implied. I documented decisions. I followed chains of command exactly as written. And slowly, the dynamic shifted. Not in my favor yet, but away from the ease others had enjoyed. I could feel how my silence was being interpreted. As disengagement, as passivity, as a lack of ambition. I heard it indirectly in how assignments were framed. This one might need a stronger presence. Let's loop Zahra in for support. Support. The word followed me again, but now it didn't sting, because I understood it. They thought I was stepping back. In reality, I was stepping out of a role that had never been mine to begin with. There's a particular discomfort that arises when someone stops playing the part you've grown accustomed to. People don't always respond with hostility. Often, they respond with confusion, with a need to reassert old patterns. Mark made more jokes, light ones, familiar ones, comments meant to restore ease. I didn't react, I didn't correct him. I simply continued the conversation as if the comment hadn't been made. That, more than any confrontation, unsettled him. Because jokes require participation. Silence starves them. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was observing what happened when I removed myself as the buffer, when I stopped absorbing friction on behalf of the group. What happened was revealing. People began preparing more carefully, speaking more cautiously, clarifying their own points before looking to me. The room adjusted, not because I demanded it, but because the safety net was gone. And still, they mistook my restraint for weakness. They assumed I was fading, that I had accepted my place, that I wasn't paying attention. They were wrong. I was paying closer attention than ever. What they never noticed was how much information passes through the hands of someone who is considered non-threatening. When people don't see you as a rival, they stop guarding themselves around you. They speak freely. They forward emails without editing. They CC you without thinking about what the thread reveals. I had been in that position for years. The quiet constant, the one who kept things moving, the one who could be trusted with complexity and discretion. And once my silence became intentional, I realized just how much visibility that role actually gave me. I saw how decisions were made long before they were announced, how responsibility was subtly conveyed through phrasing and timing, how ambiguity was used as a shield when outcomes went poorly. I didn't collect information obsessively, I collected it methodically. I kept records of decisions, timelines, and ownership. I saved versions, I documented changes, not out of suspicion, but out of professionalism. At least that's how it looked. In reality, I was building clarity. I started noticing patterns in how Mark managed risk, how he delegated pressure downward while keeping authority upward, how he relied on my work to stabilize conversations he didn't fully prepare for. How often did he position himself as the face of solutions that were structurally mine? Again, not malicious, just convenient. I also noticed something else. Clients trusted me, not loudly, not performatively, but when I spoke, they listened. When I followed up, they responded quickly. When I framed decisions, they accepted them without resistance. That trust wasn't accidental. It had been built quietly, over time, through consistency. I began strengthening it. I followed up directly with clients after calls, summarizing decisions with precise language. I clarified the scope in writing. I created documentation that aligned expectations. I made myself indispensable not through volume, but through accuracy. Internally, I positioned myself carefully. I stopped volunteering opinions in group settings where they would be diluted. Instead, I shared insights one-on-one, in contexts where they could be acted on without distortion. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing terrain. I also started learning things that weren't technically my responsibility. Contract structures, liability clauses, escalation pathways, the kind of knowledge that sits just outside most job descriptions, but shapes outcomes. No one questioned it. After all, I was detail-oriented. That label opened doors no one realized were doors. I became fluent in the firm's internal language of accountability. I learned how risk was quantified, how errors were absorbed, and how narratives were shaped for leadership. And I noticed something important. The people who spoke the loudest often left the least trace. Decisions made verbally evaporated. Assertions without documentation dissolved, but written clarity endured. So I wrote, not emotionally, not defensively, precisely. Emails that confirmed understanding, memos that outlined responsibilities, follow-ups that summarized agreements. Each one was small, reasonable, unremarkable on its own. Together, they formed a record. I never corrected Mark publicly. I never challenged him in meetings. I didn't need to. The system was already recording itself through me. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It builds leverage through alignment with reality. I wasn't plotting, I was preparing. Preparing for the possibility that respect would not return on its own. That professionalism, when unreciprocated, becomes exposure. What they never noticed was that while they were mistaking my calm for compliance, I was aligning myself with the only thing that matters in the long run: facts. And facts, unlike jokes, don't require permission to matter. By the time the groundwork was in place, no one had changed their behavior toward me. No one suspected a shift. They thought I was the same Zahra, reliable, quiet, useful. They didn't realize I had stopped being invisible. I had become positioned. The moment of realization didn't arrive like a revelation. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of victory. It came quietly, the way truth often does, through accumulation. I was reviewing a series of documents late one evening. Routine work officially. A cross-check of deliverables tied to a long-running client account. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was verifying alignment, what had been promised, what had been delivered, and how responsibility had been framed at each stage. That's when I saw it. A discrepancy, small on the surface. A timeline adjustment was approved verbally but never formalized. A scope expansion that had been acknowledged in meetings but never reflected in the contract addendum. My follow-up emails had noted the shift. Mark had replied with brief confirmations. Thumbs up language. Yes, aligned. Sounds good. But nothing had been escalated. Nothing had been officially documented at the leadership level. The liability sat in a gray zone. And in that gray zone, accountability becomes negotiable, unless someone has records. I sat back in my chair and let the information settle. Not triumphantly, not fearfully, just carefully, I cross-referenced other accounts, other moments where clarity had been assumed rather than secured, where I had been asked to smooth things over without formal backing. The pattern was unmistakable. I wasn't holding secrets, I was holding a structure. If anything went wrong, financially, legally, reputationally, the burden would fall downward, on execution, on delivery, on people like me, unless clarity existed. And clarity, I realized, already did. In my files, in my emails, in the quiet documentation no one had thought to question because it came from someone they didn't perceive as a threat. That was the private reveal. Not that I had power, but that I had protection. Protection is built through professionalism, through precision, through restraint that had been mistaken for submission. I didn't feel the urge to act immediately. In fact, I felt the opposite, a sense of calm, of alignment, as if something that had been off balance for a long time had finally found its center. I understood then that leverage doesn't require aggression, it requires a position. And I had it. What I did next was not dramatic. I didn't alert anyone, I didn't confront Mark, I didn't prepare a case. I organized. I created a clean chronological record. I ensured everything was accessible, accurate, and unemotional. I made sure my language was neutral, factual, and professional. If someone else read it, it wouldn't sound like a defense. It would sound like the truth. I also reviewed my own actions, checked for gaps, corrected anything that could be misinterpreted. I made sure my conduct was beyond reproach, because leverage only holds if it rests on integrity. That night, I closed my laptop with a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I wasn't hoping for respect. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I wasn't strategizing how to be seen. I knew where I stood. The power dynamic hadn't flipped, but it had stabilized. The ground was firm beneath my feet, and with that clarity came a choice. I could surface what I knew, force a reckoning, demand correction, or I could wait, not passively, intentionally, because leverage doesn't disappear if you don't use it immediately. It matures. And I had learned enough by then to know that timing matters as much as truth. I went to sleep that night without replaying conversations in my head, without rehearsing responses, without carrying the weight of unspoken frustration. I wasn't celebrating. I was ready. Once you know you have leverage, the hardest part isn't using it. It's deciding who you want to be when you do. For a while, I lived in that pause. Not frozen, considering. I went about my work as usual, delivered what was expected, and maintained the same calm presence. On the surface, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. I saw the paths clearly. One option was to confront Mark directly, present the documentation, frame it as a concern, ask for respect, clarity, and correction. That would have been clean, rational, possibly effective. But it would also have placed the burden back on me, to educate, to explain, to manage the aftermath, to trust that someone who hadn't noticed the erosion before would suddenly recognize it now. Another option was escalation, formal channels, HR leadership, a process designed to neutralize discomfort, not resolve it. I'd seen how those pathways worked: slow, careful, protective of the system first. Truth filtered through policy tends to lose its edge. There was also the option I had been trained to take: do nothing, continue absorbing, continue performing professionalism as endurance, let the moment pass as others had before it. That option required the least immediate effort. It also required the most self-erasure. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who believed excellence was enough, who thought patience was always rewarded, who trusted that people would notice what mattered if you just stayed steady. I realized something uncomfortable. That version of me had done everything right and still been placed where it was convenient. The problem wasn't a single comment, or even a single person. It was a structure that benefited from my restraint while slowly diminishing my authority. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want validation. I wanted alignment. The irreversible choice wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about removing myself from a system that required my silence to function. So I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped positioning my future inside that team. Quietly, I began exploring options that didn't depend on Mark's approval. I reached out to contacts I trusted, former clients, industry peers, people who knew my work without filtering it through the hierarchy. I didn't complain. I didn't tell my story. I spoke about skills, outcomes, and interests. And the response was immediate. Not enthusiastic, certain. There were opportunities, roles that valued precision, leadership that didn't need translation. That clarity settled something in me. I realized that staying and fixing the system would require ongoing labor. Leaving would require only integrity. I chose the path that didn't ask me to keep explaining my worth. From that moment on, my actions aligned with that decision. I continued documenting, continued delivering, continued being professional. But my loyalty shifted from preserving harmony to preserving self-respect. That was the irreversible part. Once you decide that your dignity is not negotiable, You can't unsee the compromises you were asked to make before. And once you stop building your future in a place that depends on your silence, everything you do changes, even if no one else notices yet. They didn't know it then, but the outcome had already been set in motion. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally, meetings still happened, deadlines still came and went, but internally, I moved with a different rhythm. Purpose replaced anticipation. I wasn't waiting for change anymore, I was executing it, quietly. I didn't announce anything. I didn't hint. I didn't pull away dramatically. That would have created noise, and noise invites interference. Instead, I became even more precise, even more aligned with the process. I reviewed my contract carefully, not with suspicion, with understanding. Notice periods, confidentiality clauses, non-compete language, what I owed, what I didn't, where my obligations ended, and where my autonomy began. There's power in knowing the rules better than the people who assume you won't read them. I continued documenting everything: decisions, approvals, scope clarifications. If something was discussed verbally, I followed up in writing, not to protect myself emotionally, but to protect reality. No one questioned it. This was already my reputation: thorough, detail oriented, safe. I scheduled conversations externally during lunch breaks and early mornings, informational, not transactional. I listened more than I spoke. I learned how others framed leadership, accountability, and respect. The contrast was subtle, but unmistakable. In those spaces, no one joked about my voice. No one softened my authority. No one needed a translation. My clarity stood on its own. Back at work, Mark remained unchanged. Still familiar, still casual, still confident that the dynamic was stable. That's the thing about moving in silence. People measure change by behavior, not intention, and my behavior hadn't changed enough to alarm anyone. I met every deadline. I stayed calm. I delivered. But I stopped overextending. I stopped rescuing poorly framed ideas. I stopped volunteering to carry what wasn't mine. The system adjusted, slightly, awkwardly, but it didn't attribute the shift to me. It couldn't. I hadn't broken character. I had simply become exact. There's a misconception that quiet strength looks like withdrawal. In reality, it looks like alignment, like doing only what you are responsible for. Nothing more, nothing less. That discipline unsettles environments built on informal dependency. Still, no one confronted me. No one sensed urgency. Because urgency lives in emotion, and I wasn't emotional. Behind the scenes, conversations continued. Options narrowed. A role emerged that aligned not just with my skills, but with my values. One where leadership wasn't performative, where professionalism wasn't confused with endurance. I didn't accept it immediately. I waited, not out of fear, but out of respect for timing. I wanted to leave cleanly, ethically, with nothing that could be reframed later. So I prepared the ground: transition notes, clear documentation, clean handovers. I made it impossible to say I had left chaos behind me. Ironically, this only reinforced the perception that I was stable, that I was staying, that I wasn't going anywhere. People don't expect departure from those who make things easier. That assumption is their blind spot. By the time the final pieces were in place, the decision was no longer fragile. It didn't depend on approval or reaction. It existed independently. I hadn't burned bridges. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't demanded recognition. I had simply stepped into a future that didn't require explanation. And still no one noticed. Not yet. The first signs didn't look like consequences. They looked confused. It started small. A meeting that ran over time. A client's email has been unanswered longer than usual. A document that came back with comments instead of clean approval. Nothing alarming. Nothing anyone could point to and say, "This is wrong." But the ease was gone. I noticed it before anyone else did. Not because I was watching for it, but because I had been the one absorbing those frictions for so long. When you remove a quiet support, the structure doesn't collapse. It wobbles. People began asking more questions in meetings, clarifying things that had once been implicit. There was more back and forth, more follow-up, more uncertainty around decisions that used to land smoothly. Mark seemed irritated, though he couldn't quite explain why. "This client is being unusually picky," he said once, after a call that should have been straightforward. I nodded. I had no reason to. Another time, he remarked, "We're spending a lot of time circling simple issues lately." Again, I agreed, calmly, professionally. What he didn't say, what he didn't yet understand, was that the circling had always been there. It just used to happen through me. Colleagues started reaching out more frequently, not with urgency, but with reliance. Can you take a look at this? Does this sound right to you? How would you explain this to the client? I answered precisely. Only what was asked, nothing extra. And that difference mattered. Where I once anticipated needs, I now respond to requests. Where I once bridged gaps silently, I now waited for alignment. The work still got done, but it required more effort from everyone else. That effort registered as friction, not my friction, theirs. Clients noticed too, not consciously, but in tone. They asked for clarifications they hadn't needed before. They requested follow-ups, they wanted written confirmations. I provided them, cleanly, professionally. But I didn't manage perception anymore. I managed facts. And facts, when unbuffered, demand accountability. Mark began joining calls more closely, preparing more, speaking more carefully. The jokes tapered, not because he'd reflected, but because the room felt different now, less forgiving, less cushioned. He didn't connect it to me. That was the strangest part. When you've been invisible long enough, your absence doesn't look like absence. It looks like deterioration in the environment, like something intangible has gone missing. People assume it's the workload, the market, the client, anything but the person who quietly made things easier. I watched it all without satisfaction. This wasn't vindication, it was confirmation. Confirmation that my presence had mattered far more than my position suggested, that the respect I hadn't been given had still been earned through labor, not acknowledgement. And now that labor was being redistributed, unevenly, I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't detached either. I felt a calm sense of inevitability. Systems behave predictably when inputs change. Remove a stabilizer and the variance increases. That's not punishment. That's math. Still, no one accused me of anything. No one challenged my performance. My work remained solid. My demeanor is unchanged, which made the consequences harder to name and impossible to reverse. By the time Mark began expressing concern to leadership about operational drag, the pattern had already set. More oversight was added, more process, more meetings. These are the very things that slow teams down when trust hasn't been structured properly. I didn't say, this is what happens when you rely on unacknowledged labor. I didn't need to. The system was saying it for me. By the time anyone tried to fix things, they couldn't agree on what was broken. That's always how it goes. When problems surface slowly, people search for fast explanations. They look for new variables instead of acknowledging the ones that were always there. Leadership scheduled more check-ins, process reviews, alignment meetings. Words like efficiency and streamlining started appearing in subject lines. There was talk of restructuring workflows, redistributing responsibility, and tightening communication. All of it missed the point. You can't streamline around a missing center. Mark was under pressure now. It showed, not in anger, but in restlessness. He asked more questions than he answered. He double-checked things he used to wave through. The ease he once carried had evaporated. One afternoon, he asked to speak with me privately. "Have you noticed things feeling heavier lately?" he said, choosing his words carefully. I had noticed. I just didn't frame it that way. "I think we're seeing the impact of increased complexity," I replied. Neutral, accurate, safe. He nodded, unsatisfied. "I've been thinking," he continued, "maybe we need to reset some expectations, make sure everyone's aligned." It was an invitation, a vague one, an opening to do what I had always done, absorb uncertainty, translate it into reassurance, smooth the edges. I didn't. "I agree clarity is important," I said. "Documented roles and decisions usually help with that." Again he nodded, again nothing changed. This was the moment he might have asked me directly what I needed, or acknowledged the pattern, or reflected on how dynamics had shifted. He didn't, not because he didn't care, but because the system had trained him not to see me as someone whose experience required examination. By then it was too late. The offer I had been considering had become firm. The timeline was set. I had reviewed everything twice. My transition plan was complete. I hadn't shared it yet. Not out of secrecy, but out of principle. I wanted the conversation to be about departure, not negotiation. Mark tried other things, delegated differently, took on more of himself, even made an effort to be more formal on calls, less joking, more structure. It was noticeable. It was also insufficient. You can't retroactively assign respect. Once someone has learned how much they can take from you without consequence, they don't suddenly understand where the line should have been. The team felt the tension. Questions lingered unanswered. Decisions stalled. People looked for reassurance that didn't come, not because I withheld it, but because reassurance without authority doesn't hold. Leadership sensed something was off, but couldn't locate it. Metrics didn't capture erosion. Surveys don't measure dignity. By the time Mark circled back again, asking if I saw myself growing here long term, the answer had already expired. I looked at him and realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't even feel regret. I felt done, not in a dramatic way, in a settled one. He was trying to fix a system that had already moved past the point where my presence could restore it, because what was missing now wasn't efficiency. It was trust. And trust, once misaligned, doesn't return on command. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. No build-up, no urgency, just a calendar invite titled check-in, the kind that suggests routine, not consequence. Mark's camera was on when I joined. He looked tired. Not defeated, just worn in the way people get when they sense something slipping but don't know how to name it. "Thanks for making time," he said. "Of course," I replied. There was a pause. He adjusted his notes. "I wanted to talk about your trajectory here," he began. "You're a core part of the team. Things haven't felt as smooth lately, and I'm wondering how you're feeling." There it was, concern framed as curiosity, responsibility diffused into the atmosphere. I didn't correct him. I didn't recount history. I didn't raise my voice. I told the truth. "I've accepted another role," I said. "I wanted to let you know before it was announced." The silence that followed was long enough to register, but not uncomfortable. Just real. He blinked. Okay, that's unexpected." "I understand. Can I ask why?" I nodded. Yes, I chose my words carefully, not to protect him, but to protect myself from unnecessary explanation. "I realized I was doing a lot of work that required authority without being given it," I said, "and I don't want to keep compensating for that." He frowned slightly, not in disagreement, in processing. "I thought you were comfortable here," he said. "I was effective here," I replied. "That's not the same thing." Another pause. He looked down at his notes, then back up. "If there were moments you felt disrespected, that wasn't my intention." "I know," I said. "Intent wasn't the issue." He waited, perhaps expecting more. An example, a moment, a chance to contextualize. I didn't give him one, because this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a feedback session. It was a boundary. "I'm happy to ensure a clean transition," I added. "I've already documented everything." Of course I had. He nodded slowly. "I wish you'd said something sooner." I held his gaze. "I was professional," I said, calmly, not defensively, "and professionalism has limits." He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. I didn't realize. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. That was the end of it. No apologies demanded, no accusations made, no emotion spilled, just clarity. After the call ended, I sat for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was shaken, but because I was aware of something closing cleanly. The confrontation, if it could be called that, had no heat because it didn't need any. Heat is for battles. This was an exit. And exits don't require victory speeches. They require alignment. After I left, people expected a shift in me. They assumed I would be lighter, or angrier, or relieved in a way that needed to be spoken aloud, that there would be some visible transformation, confidence amplified, posture changed, a story ready to tell. None of that happened. What changed wasn't how I appeared, it was how I oriented myself. In my new role, no one asked me to translate my authority into something more comfortable. When I spoke, people listened, not because I demanded it, but because the structure supported it. Decisions had owners, language had weight. Respect wasn't something you earned retroactively, it was built into the system. That alone was disorienting at first. I noticed how often I paused, expecting interruption, how I softened statements that didn't need softening. Old reflexes don't disappear just because the environment improves. But over time, something settled. I stopped editing myself for safety. I stopped anticipating dismissal. I stopped confusing calm with containment. I didn't become louder, I became clearer. There was no triumph in it, no sense of having won, just a quiet recognition that I was finally operating at my natural scale, not expanded, not diminished. People still describe me as dependable. That hasn't changed. The difference is that dependability no longer comes with invisibility. It comes with trust, with authorship, with consequence. I often think about how close I came to staying, how easy it would have been to keep absorbing small cuts and calling it maturity, to keep believing that respect would arrive eventually if I just remained patient enough. But patience without boundaries isn't a virtue, it's erosion. I don't resent my former colleagues. I don't even resent Mark. He operated within a system that rewarded ease over reflection. So did I for a long time. What I carry forward isn't bitterness, it's discernment. I pay attention now to how people treat quiet competence. To whom is it allowed to be imprecise? To whom is it expected to compensate? Those patterns don't announce themselves, but they reveal everything. And when I see them, I don't argue. I choose. That's who I am now. Not someone hardened by experience, but someone sharpened by it. Someone who understands that dignity doesn't require drama, and authority doesn't require noise. It requires alignment. There's a temptation, when telling stories like this, to frame them as cautionary tales, to point fingers, to assign villains and heroes. That's never been the point. What happened to me wasn't extraordinary. It wasn't even rare. It was the result of small, unexamined moments repeating long enough to become a structure, of professionalism being mistaken for permission, of quiet competence being treated as elastic, something that could stretch indefinitely without consequence. The moral of this story isn't speak up at the first sign of disrespect. That advice is too simple for real life. Sometimes speaking up costs more than staying quiet, especially in systems that reward comfort over accountability. The deeper lesson is this: your silence teaches people how to treat you, not because you are weak, but because systems adapt to what they're given. If you absorb discomfort without naming it, the system learns that you will. If you compensate without recognition, the system learns that it can rely on you without adjusting. And eventually, what began as professionalism becomes expectation. I didn't leave because of a joke, or a comment, or even a pattern of them. I left because I realized that staying would require me to keep translating my value into something easier for others to digest. And that cost, quietly, steadily, was mine alone. There is no drama in choosing dignity. There is no spectacle in setting boundaries. There is only clarity. If you find yourself being described as reliable, but never authoritative, if your work is trusted, but your voice is softened, if you're praised privately and diminished publicly, it may not be a personal failure. It may be a signal, and signals aren't meant to be ignored forever. You don't need to shout. You don't need to expose anyone. You don't need to wait for permission. Sometimes, the most powerful move is simply refusing to continue in a role that requires your erasure. That's not revenge. That's alignment. So I'll leave you with this, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever realized, a little too late, that your professionalism was being used to excuse someone else's lack of respect? And what did you choose to do when you finally saw it? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.